First up, even if Chinese economic growth comes in at the low side, now that equates to around 5% per annum, the country would still be adding an economy the size of South Africa every year. That really gives us context. But while growth has continued uninterrupted for the last 5 decades, there are significant risks facing the country's development going forward. And here to describe what the Chinese effect will have on our own prospects is Glenn Silverman from Investment Solutions. Always a pleasure to have you in studio. You've recently been to China and obviously you've done some kicking of the tires on the ground. Glenn, we're excited to hear what you've discovered.
Thank you. Where would you like me to start?
What are the risks that China poses to South Africa in a current slower growth environment?
So I think starting point is China is an enormous country, 1.3 billion people. Its impact is going to be felt everywhere. And the fact that we've spent 21 days, had 63 meetings, met with a lot of people does not mean we understand China, a very, very complex country. And in every level there's pros and cons, and it's very veiled, very difficult to kind of see through it. So I think China, which has grown, as you said, for 50 years at very, very strong growth rates, is going to slow. I think that's unequivocal. Even the leadership would say that, and they're trying to manage expectations down from 8 to 7%. Amazing to see the market's response to a 6.9 instead of a 7, a multiplier effect when in fact you think 0.1, what difference does it really make? But we think it's going to slow more than that because it has to. It's just very, very large. $8.2 trillion economy, and as you say, can add something like a South Africa every year, even if it slows down to 5%. But there are risks building. The 3 major ones we identified: property market, very, very expensive. Not strictly China, but places like Hong Kong, most expensive market in the world, Singapore, but even Beijing, Shanghai, very, very expensive.
So are we talking a property bubble here?
We're talking potentially a property bubble. We compare it to, for example, South Africa, Johannesburg, and you'll find, I don't know, Hong Kong 16 times more expensive, or Beijing 8 times more expensive for much smaller properties, no swimming pool, no tennis court, no gardens, whatever. It looks very expensive to me. I'm no property expert, but I think property is the first risk.
Warren, do you want to jump in there? You've been eyeing out the property market.
I do, because it varies from the one side. Obviously, those cities on the eastern seaboard are very expensive. They are massive cities. I mean, you just look at the size of the average Chinese city on the seaboard there, and it's north of 15 million people, some of these places. But the other risk, Glenn, is that they've gone and built too much.
Yes.
This fixed investment strategy that they've taken, they've got ghost cities they're talking about. So how do you kind of tie all these risks up, and is it big enough to be a systemic risk to that economy?
So maybe just on that property one, you're so right in saying what you did. They have something called a tier 1 city, which is kind of the big 4 places. And in those things, I'm pretty convinced those places, it looks very, very expensive. But they've also got tier 2 cities, smaller cities, and tier 3, even smaller, and I cannot comment on those. We look at some of the average numbers and they're much less expensive in terms of property prices. So tier 1 is done. An amazing statistic, whatever, I don't know, they said 10 years ago, 75% of all the world cranes used to be between Shanghai and Beijing, those 2 cities. They're not there anymore. And in CAs, they built, they're fully occupied. So risk 1 was property. Second is your point, overinvestment. And we've got graphs in terms of returns on investments. They're coming down quite sharply, especially in what they call the state-owned enterprises, which is the heart of that economy. So much bigger than the private sector, etc. And the returns are falling quite sharply. Now, if that goes below the cost of capital, you have a real problem. And then the third element would be debt.
Which is, and we know we've spoken extensively about the municipal debt and those levels that people aren't sure about. Do you get that sense that this is the tip of the iceberg when we chat about it? We don't know the reality of the situation.
So part of this program is part of our BRICS program. Each 6 months we go and visit Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And I presented a stat after our first presentation saying that debt levels in China, official debt, about 23%. That's government debt levels. And we said, gee whiz, compared to the States at over 100%, and most of Western, Europe, etc., and Japan at over 200%, that didn't look bad at all. But returning from our trip, we've seen very different numbers. When we add debt that sits elsewhere, we can get to 200% and plus debt to GDP in China. So you're quite right, hard to find. These are stats from Goldman Sachs, from Fitch, from people who have worked and dug very hard into the system. And yes, it might sit in the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, not at government level, but government backs all of that. So I think debt actually is a problem there.
Just coming back to that, Glenn, we've seen famed short sellers like James Chanos at Kinnikos and Associates becoming very, I guess you call it bullish or bearish. Bullish for him because he is a bear. He's a short seller, and he's talked about the system. You mentioned earlier it's very hard to get an understanding of China. the American short sellers, obviously a very different political system in China, don't quite understand how this centrally controlled government can deliver, as we've mentioned, growth of 50 years or 5 decades in the making. What's your sort of sense of the government involvement in the economy, and is this control that they utilize through these state-owned enterprises going to continue to be able to deliver this growth going forward?
They're all good questions, and they ask very searching questions of you when you go to China. You have to really kind of engage. Number one would be, how much do you trust the data? And I'd say with quite a high level of confidence, those data is going back decades around the 50s and 60s, probably not to be very well trusted. But the growth has been there. You can just see the hundreds of millions and of people that have been lifted out of poverty and the consequence thereof. But data is a real issue. You've heard many comments that they print the data before the quarter has ended, etc., etc. And we've got some stats to show in some ways it could be quite managed, but nevertheless there's been kind of very strong growth. Second comment is just the control of the central government over that economy. And what they have is something called a 5-year plan. And then they give it to the state-owned enterprises and they drive it from top down through the economy. Very effective in terms of implementation, very clear in terms of clarity of policy, stuff we can learn about here in South Africa as well. But obviously it also leads to inefficiencies, problems, corruption. I mean, and you can see the Chinese government itself very focused on corruption and the implications of it. So it's very interesting because people say about this Chinese economy, command, top-down, etc., very different to America, for example, has done so well and so much better. Actually, there's a lot of bottom-up too. There's a lot of free enterprise. And my colleague Lesiba went in terms of the smaller Tier 2 cities, and he said it felt only like free enterprise. So when you're in Beijing, you feel the party, kind of overhang you very strongly. In other parts of China, actually very entrepreneurial and very aggressive negotiators and businessmen.
You mentioned in your report the National Development Plan and South African similarities between China and South Africa. What should we be learning from China, and what should we avoid in terms of any of the pitfalls that you've seen in that territory?
So the starting point, we just can't consider ourselves to be China. We've got 50 million people, they've got 1.3 billion. So for example, they have overinvested in certain infrastructure, but that's almost a philosophy, build it and they will come. With 1.3 billion people behind you, they may well come and you can sort that out. We could never take
what about, so then perhaps the comparison is Africa. They often say that Africa is 20 years behind China. Can you use that as a comparative?
You may be able to, but again, each country, and I've made the statement when we did our India presentation, our India review, India is made up of 28 states. There is no Indian strategy. It doesn't exist. Each state is a separate state, very different, very complex. There's no Africa strategy. It doesn't exist. Every country is different. Don't tell Zimbabwe because South Africa did this, you need to do the same. Don't tell the Nigerians.
In fact, you're going to get a huge amount of resistance if you try that.
Yeah, and you do get resistance. So there's no such thing as an African strategy. Africa would be very similar in totality to India or China in terms of scale, number of countries, number of dialects, ethnic groupings, population, 1 billion people in Africa and 1.2, 1.3 billion in India and China. So there are similarities, but there's no such thing as an Africa strategy, I don't believe, nor an India strategy. But the whole discussion around an NDP, which we're very supportive of, we think a national development plan is exactly what we do need. But we did, for example, some comparisons between the two. South African NDP is 444 pages long. The Chinese 5-year plan is 63 pages. And Lesiba, who's the head of our market
let's just put that in context,
444 pages
44,
long.
That's the NDP.
That's the NDP.
And the Chinese documentation, 66. And that's a 5-year plan.
5-year plan in multiple sizes, In fact, the amazing comment was a company called Vale, one of the large resource companies in Brazil. We're talking at one of the conferences that we attended. He said he's actually extracted from the 66 pages, that part that it pertains to him. He puts it on A4 paper and he keeps it permanently in his pocket wherever he goes because he knows that is policy. It will be implemented. It will be implemented at huge cost. And China is known for more executions in the world than the rest of the world combined. If they want to implement it and they want to get policy across, they do it in very, very determined fashion. And I think that's something we can learn. Maybe just we need to know exactly what we've agreed to. It needs to be implemented very strongly. They are good at implementation.
Glenn, I wanted to just turn our attention to how this change in China, the risks facing China, the change in terms of the lower economic growth that China's likely to experience, and its changing structure within its economy is going to affect us. And perhaps you could just cloud that or color that with the very good, and I think we should give the government credit for this, relations that they have developed with China and as broadly as part of Africa, but the South African government has certainly made it very user-friendly for, I guess, bilateral trade agreements between the two countries. So perhaps you can just share us your insights.
So there's a few subtopics there. I mean, the one you touch on, and I think is something that we presented on and we cover, the special bond that exists between China and South Africa. It was actually mentioned many, many times. Comments like Africa is our friend, very high links between the senior Politburo members of the Chinese Communist Party and the ANC. So you're right, we've been successful in building that relationship. What was amazing to me, and I didn't know this, is it was China that invited South Africa to join the BRICS. The first BRIC conferences were BRIC, no S. And China actually stepped out and said, we need an African representative, and they chose South Africa. So the special bonds are there, the relationships had built up, and they were powerful. And we saw a number of South African companies who'd been probably more successful. I mean, the most success was Naspers. There's no one to kind of compete with it in terms of Tencent and what it's done and the impact it's had on Naspers, etc. But that special bond is very much there. We speak also about China in terms of transition. There are multiple transitions. Firstly, there's new leadership that's just come in. And they are having what they call their national plenum in November. They're going to talk about their new vision for the economy. So you've got new leadership there, and then this change in the economy, the slowdown, but it's not only the slowdown. They're also trying to convert that economy away from manufacturing exports towards consumption. And we think these things take years, maybe they take decades, and they come with risk.
Where are you going next? You say every 6 months you and your team are off to survey one of the BRICS environments.
The last one we haven't seen yet is Russia. I'm glad I left it to the end because I think it's quite an anomalous country. And I think it's going to be very, very different. It might be a nice way to wrap it up. I mean, the one thing that really kind of struck me there is this being a communist country that took a lot of learnings from Lenin. I'm going back 50 years, but nevertheless, if you look at the history of China, what happened in Russia with their Communist Party was very influential on the Chinese. So I think there's going to be lots of interesting stuff that take place. We also understand the Russians were the guys who put that whole BRICS together. So China invited South Africa, but the whole concept of putting this BRIC concept together, standing against the West and doing whatever else the BRICS are meant to do, and it's evolving. Business councils, a development bank is being spoke about, there was comment in the paper today, etc. Started with Russia.
Glenn, you got time for one more?
I'm just going to make a comment. I think I was watching the IAAF World Championships, which were hosted in Moscow, and we saw the marathon runners running. So it actually looked like a very beautiful city on a sunny day. So maybe we'll all, I guess, be pleasantly surprised, because I certainly have a negative perception of Russia. So might be something there for us to learn.
The one stat that we did point out, we've got a ranking of the different world players in terms of corruption, and they rate Russia as amongst the most corrupt countries in the world. Oligarch, mafia, etc. I hope I come back in one piece. We'll let you know. But the number of people that have said to me,
we want your pictures. We're going to put them up all over the studio.
The number of people who said to me, can we join you on the Russia trip, has been amazing. So I think there is something about Russia that does appeal.
Glenn, thanks so much for your time. Glenn Silverman, Chief Investment Officer of Investment Solutions.